This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So thank you very much, Sashika, for a very generous introduction. Thank you, Niall and Sietske. It's been a wonderfully organized conference. I'm very pleased to be here. Very honored also to give the opening lecture. But I especially look forward very much to hearing the other papers later today. So, to do or not to do. The massive translation migration of classical texts from antiquity into Latin and the vernaculars during the Middle Ages and Renaissance, often via Arabic and Hebrew, has traditionally received much attention from intellectual historians and historians of science. In contrast, in this lecture, I concentrate on contexts involving the confrontation with local knowledge. This entails problems of how to express information and knowledge for which no equivalent in learned circles and the languages they used were available. The most typical context in the early modern period is that of the encounter with local plants and plant names, in particular outside Europe. Travelers were confronted with a plethora of unknown names, terms, and concepts. However, the definition and naming of both natural phenomena and the categories to which they belonged could sometimes prove controversial, even in the same dialect. One of the major problems was the lack of completeness. What was included in the Book of Nature kept expanding, with a consequent expansion of vocabulary. Structurally similar to the processes of naming in the encounter with the indigenous non-European plants is the invention of vocabulary in the context of artisanal workshops and the appropriation of this terminology in print and translation when no equivalent in Latin or the vernaculars existed. So this lecture is about the translation of artisanal knowledge. This audience surely knows that the English word derives from the Latin translatio, meaning to transfer or transport from one place to another. A handing over, or even in horticulture, a grafting of one living stem onto another. When referring to writing practices, translatio might mean not only translation in the modern English sense of conveying the meaning of a word in an unusual way, conveying the meaning of one linguistic expression into another, but also copying or the employment of a word in an unusual way in order to convey a figurative or metaphorical meaning. Put otherwise, problems about whether or how situated knowledge can be moved to other places involve questions of translation. It's also informative, I think, to look to the Dutch translation of translatio, and there are many of you in the room who speak that language. So, vertaling, which is similar to the English translation, but also suggesting a rendering with connections to omzetting, change or transformation, and overdracht, or transferring or handing over. Translation is the process by which information and knowledge is transferred from one place to another, often being altered in the process. Change is not incidental to translation, but its very essence, even when it's not deliberate. Wherever people of different languages interact, or even where people of the same language but different places of the world speak with one another, transformations are at hand, and they deserve to be noted by historians of science. Scientific communication does not necessarily imply a universal or underlying meaning to which words and other signifiers point, nor does it necessarily imply incommensurability. Translation is a process integral to human communication. However, beyond this philosophical point, making the problem of translation integral to the human condition, it's worth studying the practice of translation historically, because translation practices have changed. And in this lecture, I argue that the translation, also in the sense of rendering or verbalization of artisanal knowledge, changed in the early modern period. And this goes to the heart of one of the major issues in the history of early modern science, which has been considered and reconsidered since the generation of Leonardo Olszki and Edgar Zilsel. The study of the translation of artisanal knowledge is, I think, a new approach to questions about the origins of early modern science in artisanal cultures. In a most recent book, Pamela Long argues that in the 15th and 16th centuries, trading zones, and that's a term she borrows from Peter Gallison's analysis of modern physics, trading zones emerged, creating the conditions for the exchange of knowledge and empirical values between artisans and scholars. Early modern trading zones consisted of, quote, arenas in which the learned taught the skilled, and the skilled taught the learned, and in which the knowledge involved in each arena was valued by both kinds of traders. The use of the concept of trading zone emphasizes language. Gallison describes it as, quote, characterized by the development of pidgin languages and at times full-scale Creole languages as a means of communication between people from two different cultures. Language is a central concern for Long. And most appropriately, she relates that the invention of fire made possible a whole range of crafts, but above all, according to Vitruvius, prompted, quote, early humans to gather around fires, and this new proximity led them to begin to communicate and acquire language. However, while Long is primarily focused on the detecting interactions between vernacular artisans and learned humanists who knew Latin and had received a university education, I want to emphasize translations of artisanal knowledge or the processes of structuring and restructuring practical knowledge in writings on the arts. My own background in the study of translation and the circulation of knowledge, as Siske had nicely pointed out, is this recent book, Translating Knowledge in the Early Modern Low Countries, which I edited together with Harold Cook. And this is a very long book advertisement, yeah, so be prepared. Before I turn to the main topic of my lecture, I think it's worth, nevertheless, taking a moment to look at some of the more general issues on translation we were concerned with in the book. The confrontation of the translator with local knowledge and objects was central to the book. When shifting the focus of translation studies in this way, the first important insight is that multilingualism is the key issue that demands study. For example, in her chapter, Florica Agmund points out that Latin and vernacular languages and names coexisted in the practice and publication of plant knowledge from the 1550s. Although Latin names were used to facilitate international communication, Latin did not have a special conceptual status in developing a classification, nor did it have a higher status than the vernacular languages or local names for indigenous plants. And this offers an important corrective to the dominant historiography, which has almost entirely focused on the translation movement from Latin to the vernaculars and the so-called rise of the vernacular. Instead, Agmund argues multilingualism was the norm. The coexistence of Latin and the vernaculars in botany found an equivalent in the arts. In a chapter on Franciscus Junius' translation of his Latin The Painting of the Ancients into Dutch, for example, Thijs Westijn points out that bilingual publication was the norm in the literature of art in the early modern period. For the Dutch translation, unlike the English translation, which he undertook at the same time, Junius went through considerable efforts to invent a Dutch language of art. And when Karel van Mander's groundbreaking work in Northern Art Theory did not offer a terminological repertoire, he relied heavily on the vocabulary used in artist studios. Karel van Mander was positive and encouraging about translation because he considered it a way to enrich the Dutch language. In yet another chapter of the book, Paul Taylor shows that van Mander himself used very few Italian terms because he had at his disposal a large and rich body of words in Dutch. And so he did not feel the need to use Italian terms when Dutch ones already adequately filled the semantic field. And finally, writing on translations of Renaissance architectural treatises in the Low Countries, about which we will hear more later on today, Christa de Jonge shows that Pieter Cooke van Aal's translation translations of Vitruvius and Serlio preferred a sort of Greco-Latin terminology which Cooker considered universal in crossing geographical and social boundaries. In the Dutch Republic, however, Salon de Bresse and Simon Steven's preference for the supposedly more Dutch-sounding equivalents replaced Cook's search for universal vocabulary according to de Jonge. So these studies show that problems of translation of writings on the arts between languages intermingle with problems of translation between practice and words. And they also suggest that choices and strategies of translation depend upon the attitudes toward translation and toward the languages used in artisanal workshops. In this lecture, I'll revisit such issues regarding the translation of artisanal knowledge, taking as my central object of investigation the translation the alchemist Johannes Kunkel, here to the left, made of Antonio Neri's L'Arte Vetraria, here to the right, in 1679. Neri's treatise was the first printed book on glass making, but it drew heavily on collections of recipes circulating in manuscripts. There's a long history of writing about technology taking the form of recipes reaching back to antiquity. We have clay tablets inscribed with Babylonian glass recipes, and the so-called Leiden and Stockholm papyri contain recipes for several arts and crafts with a long after history reaching well into the 17th century. In fact, one of the most common formats used to reproduce artisanal experience is the recipe, telling the reader how to. By the early modern period, recipes were ubiquitous, aptly collected in manuscript notebooks, publicized in books of secrets flooding the printing markets. They purported to instruct readers how to color glass, make gold, brew a medicine, and entertains one's guests by creating illusory images with only a few mirrors. For all their diversity of purpose, they were all the same when it came to attempting to fix in words artisanal knowledge, which otherwise would have been confined within the walls of the workshop. As we all know from our struggles with IKEA manuals and cookbooks, the correspondence between how-to instructions and practice is often more problematic than we would wish. Words typically fall short of unambiguously describing the materials and processes, leading to the desired result, be that red glass or medicine. It's telling that historians of technology have only attributed a limited, if any, role to recipes in the learning of a trade within the context of master-apprentice relationships in the workshop. Learning by doing was the standard. Recipes are translations. They moved artisanal knowledge beyond the workshop. A good many of the late medieval and early modern recipes that have come down to us concern the visual and decorative arts. Giannino Cennini's Libro dell'Arte is one of the more well-known collections, whose fame probably is only matched by the recipes and workshop secrets, which the physician Theodore de Mayenne compiled on the basis of conversations with Rubens, Van Dyck, and their likes. Another collection of recipes with a considerable reputation is De Diversis Artibus, compiled by the 12th century monk Theophilus. It's well known that the discovery of this manuscript led to the debunking of Vasari's attribution of the invention of oil paint to Jan van Eyck, but Theophilus also collected recipes in other domains of the crafts and decorative arts. However, these famous examples are only the tip of the iceberg. Hundreds of mostly anonymous collections of in total thousands of recipes hides beneath the surface of the water. Recipes appearing in print in 16th century books of secrets often had a prehistory in these manuscripts. And I now consider Kunkel's writings against the background of this sea of recipes. And the aim of this consideration is to find out about changes in the practices of translation of artisanal experience. In what ways was Kunkel's translation of Neri's L'Arte Vetraria different from previous writings on glassmaking? But first, a few words on Johannes Kunkel. Kunkel was born into a family of glassmakers. Trained as an apothecary, he was unable to establish his own apothecary's shop and obliged to switch careers. In 1667, he entered the service of the Elector of Saxony, Johann Georg II. His task was to work through the alchemical writings possession of the courts, of the Dresden court. And it seems that in the course of his labors, Kunkel acquired considerable knowledge of the secrets of alchemy, together with an attitude towards the written word which would later serve his work on glass. It's also clear that Kunkel was committed to a Chrysopoeic project in this period, and that he showed interest in metallic transmutation and the making of gold. After his move to Brandenburg, where his main activity was the making of glass, he continued his transmutation experiments on the Fraueninsel, here shown as Kaninchenwerder on the map. This is the island in the river Havel between Berlin and Potsdam that he received as a gift from the Elector of Brandenburg, Friedrich Wilhelm. Kunkel first came to Brandenburg in 1678 through the brokerage of Christian Menzel, the court physician, who was also responsible for the Elector's collection of Chinese books. And shortly after his arrival in Brandenburg, Kunkel was appointed to direct the glassworks in Potsdam. And he built his laboratory on the Fraueninsel for the production of crystal glass in 1686. Kunkel was granted two privileges. One for glass beads and the other for gold ruby glass. In return, he was to give the court first choice of his rare glass. The development of gold ruby glass was Kunkel's claim to fame. This glass of deep yet translucent ruby color was highly fashionable around 1700 and valued as highly as hard-paste porcelain would be only a few decades later. Kunkel's gold ruby glass is an intervention in a long history of making red-colored glass. Typically, recipes for red glass, such as that used in cathedral windows, or the translucent red enamels known as rouge clair used by goldsmiths, employed copper. At least from the early 17th century, and possibly earlier, the potential use of gold as a red colorant was known. Kunkel found his particular way of producing gold ruby glass based on the purple of Cassius, and this was a purple-colored gold solution created by mixing gold chloride and stannous chloride in aqua regia. Kunkel attributed its invention to Andreas Cassius, a physician graduated from the University of Leiden, but it was already known to Rudolf Glauber, for example. Purple of Cassius is the ideal raw material for gold ruby glass because it produces gold particles in the finest solution. And upon reheating the glass, the metallic gold forms nanoparticles. The color of the glass is due to these gold colloids, which have to be just the right size. Too small and the glass is colorless, too large and the glass looks opaque, brownish. More than merely beautiful, gold ruby glass was appreciated for its alchemical connotations. The philosopher's stone was described as a red substance, the key to the transmutation of metals, especially the making of gold. The ability to color glass red was seen as a first step towards the ultimate goal of Chrysopoeic alchemy. Kunkel did not give the secret of gold ruby glass away in the Ars Vitraria Experimentalis or the Vollkommene Glasmacher Kunst, published in 1679. Commenting on Neri's recipe using gold as a red colorant, he wrote, "Here I wish to indicate a better way and to briefly teach the making of the red of ruby glass, if it were not regarded as such a peculiarity by my gracious elector and master. Whoever does not believe that I can do it may come and see it. It's true. For now it's too rare to communicate." Now, if Kunkel's book did not serve to make public his most important secret, what then was in the book? The first part consists of a German translation of Neri's L'Arte Vitraria. The first edition of Neri's book appeared in 1612 in Italian. Neri was a Florentine alchemist, and the recipes on glass which he gathered in l'Arta Vetraria were based on his experience and readings in the glass workshop at the Casino San Marco in Florence and in the house of the Portuguese merchant banker Emanuel Ximenes and the glass workshop of Filippo Gridolfi in Antwerp. Now, what did Neri's book contain? Neri's Arta Vetraria consists of 7 books, of which only the first is devoted to the making of cristallo, so colorless glass. The other 6 books discuss several recipes for colored glass, in which the Medici, Neri, and Ximenes were all interested, especially those that imitated precious stones. Neri's book on glass is partly based on recipe collections for glass circulating in manuscripts, such as the Montpellier manuscript Ricette per far vetri colorati e smalti d'ogni sorte avute Morano 1536, and various other anonymous collections circulating in Florence. However, a very important source, especially for Book 5 on the imitation of precious stones, was Isaac Hollanders. The Antwerp painter Otto van Veen singled Hollanders out as his most important authority in alchemy. Hollanders was a post-Paracelsian, probably fictive character to whom numerous manuscripts in Dutch and translated were attributed, and who reached mythic proportions at the time, sometimes even as an alleged predecessor and source of Paracelsus. Neri read Hollanders' work in the library of Ximenes. Beyond single recipes for the making of artificial gemstones, reading the Opera Mineralia of Isaac Hollanders reinforced for Neri the similarities between glass and minerals and confronted him with the natural philosophy of vitrification. However, while partly a product of reading, experience was also important to Neri's book. For example, Book 2 of l'Arta Vetraria on the production of chalcedony glass, of which you see some earlier examples here, shows interesting variations with respect to earlier written sources related to Neri's experiments. And I will come back to this because it's important to understand in what ways Kunkel's translation of Neri's book was different. The difference has to do with the fact that in Kunkel's book, his Anmerkungen, or the comments, follow each book of l'Arta Vetraria in translation. Following Kunkel's translation and comments on Neri's l'Arta Vetraria, the Ars Vetraria contains firstly Kunkel's German translation of Christopher Merritt's notes on Neri's l'Arta Vetraria and Kunkel's Observationen und kuriosen Erinnerungen on Merritt's notes. Kunkel's publication concludes with a second book containing an independent treatise by Kunkel on different aspects of glassmaking. But let me say just a few words on Merritt. Merritt was, as probably well known, a Fellow of the Royal Society in London, and that's also something that Kunkel advertised on the title page. As part of the Royal Society's History of Trades program, he translated Neri's l'Arta Vetraria in English as The Art of Glass in 1662. And this was a considerably expanded translation, not just a rendering in English, but with the addition of notes to the different recipes of Neri, such as new experimental findings gleaned from workmen's anecdotes, practical experience, and materials of his own production. Now, I will really not say much more about Merritt's The Art of Glass, as it is the subject of a recent unpublished dissertation by Ruth Ezra, supervised by our chair, Sashiko Kusakawa. So I'll direct any questions to her, but it should be clear that Merritt was of the utmost importance to Kunkel. So let me turn directly to Kunkel's translation now, finally. His translation of the first section of the book of Neri's l'Arta Vetraria begins as follows. How to distract the salt from the powder roccata and the soda hispanica in order to prepare the fritta cristalli, which the Italians call bollito. This is the foundation of the art of glassmaking, following a completely new and secret way. This is about the making of crystalline glass, cristallo named after rock crystal because the Venetian glassmakers of Murano basically succeeded in making a glass that was as transparent and clear as natural rock crystal. And it's the basic material, according to Neri, of which all other types of colored glass are made. But the interesting point is that Kunkel did not translate several terms from Neri's Italian. One of the most striking of those terms is fritta cristalli. Why did Kunkel not translate those terms? One might argue that Kunkel simply opted for a certain regime of translation. Foreignization was one of the options open to translators, as we know. But I think that there is more to this. We might suspect that Kunkel leaves the term untranslated simply because he is forced to do so for lack of an appropriate term in German. You might remember that in my introduction, I said that according to Paul Taylor, Karel van Mander only left Italian terms untranslated if he could not use a Dutch term employed in contemporary painters' workshops in the Netherlands. However, this is not the case for Fritte. As Kunkel tells us in his Anmerkungen on the section of Neri's book, the term in German existed. Gemenge. So Neri writes, I've often heard from you glassmakers that you would really like to know what is meant by the word Fritte, which is used many times in this book. So here I tell you that it means, according to your way of speaking, no more or less than when you say Gemenge. And one Gemenge is made of so much ash and sand and so much salt, and the other Gemenge of so much. Thus what you call Gemenge is here named Fritte, so that you now also understand this term. So while the German equivalent for Fritte was used in German glass workshops, glassmakers, apparently hearing or reading the term Fritte, according to Kunkel, wondered what it meant. Instructing German glassmakers, Kunkel did not create a monolingual translation aimed at teaching them how to do something, such as in the example here, the secret of the making of crystalline glass, but offers them a foreign language vocabulary to speak about what it is they do. Historians of science have primarily focused on two processes of translation: Latinization of vernacular artisanal knowledge and vernacularization of Latin scholarly knowledge. I have said in my introductory remarks, even a recent and sophisticated book on the origins of the new sciences in artisanal cultures, such as Pamela Long's, couches this in terms of exchange and communication between a learned Latin culture and vernacular artisanal knowledge. In contrast, although the book is in German, Kunkel consciously created a multilingual environment by leaving terms untranslated. It was also a multilingual context, the availability of Neri's book in more than one language, that shaped the writing and translating of Kunkel's Ars Vitraria. The first edition of Neri's L'Arte Vitraria in 1612 was not only followed by more Italian editions in 1661, 1663, 1678, by Merritt's English translation, but also by a Latin translation of Neri, which for the first time appeared in 1668. Kunkel explicitly mentioned on the title page of his book that this was a translation of Neri's publication from the Italian and the Latin. And in a comment on Neri's recipe on golden-colored glass in the third book, Kunkel writes, "This process was the most tiresome and caused me more trouble than any other recipe in the book. This is because the quantity described by the author is not correct, but false. I had always thought that this was a mistake in the Latin version, but after I had laid my hands on the Italian version, in which it is described by the author himself, I found out that it mentions the same dose. I do not know if this is a mistake in the Italian print or by the author himself." This tells us several things. Kunkel's first access to Neri's book was through its later Latin edition. Kunkel considered the Italian edition by the author himself, as he writes, to be the most authoritative one, and that his translation was the outcome of comparing and evaluating editions in more than one language. Multilingualism was a source for translation as much as it was its outcome. The multilingual outcome of Kunkel's translation effort is not limited to the use of Italian terms, even when a German equivalent is available. His preface to the book is sprinkled with terms such as observiret, demonstrationen, operiert, experimenteert, determinierte Dosen, all of which are in the preface, but also elsewhere in the book, highlighted because they are printed in a different letter type. Most of these terms carry epistemic significance. Yeah? Just one example. It will please the diligent artisan that I only speak of those things which I have not borrowed from others, but operiert, experimenteert, and learned with my own hands. Another example, directly referring to Kunkel's claim that he tried every single one of Neri's recipes himself, that is that, quote, I do not speak here of things which I have not myself investigated and geapprobiert. Again, this epistemic category is highlighted in another letter type. So Kunkel does not just pride himself on first-hand experimentation. He also warns his reader that the recipes found in the book might not work upon the reader's first trial. This does not mean that the recipes are wrong. It's more likely that the reader made a mistake. If the reader finds himself in such a situation, Kunkel's advice is to try again and again and again. After all, he reminds his reader, it requires practice to be a master. If this sounds just slightly defensive to you, that's rightly so. But again, I think there's more to this. Pamela Smith has argued that recipes and how-to books are not always, or not only, about telling readers how to get something done, but about how to do things right. They are not, or not only about the transmission of knowledge, but about the transmission of epistemic values which were very important in artisanal workshops. One example is continuous attention, or indeed the repetition on which Kunkel puts so much emphasis. The transmission of epistemic values is one of the primary aims of Kunkel's translation of Neri. And the foreignization of terminology, catching epistemic categories such as observation and experimentation, offer the readers a richer vocabulary to speak on how to do things right. Experimentation led Kunkel to evaluate Neri's recipes. Sometimes his assessment was wholeheartedly positive. For example, on Neri's recipe for a blue color, Kunkel writes, within this chapter one has to follow the author to the letter, and this recipe gives a very charming color of this kind. More often, however, experimentation led him to adapt recipes, especially to local circumstances, practices, and raw materials. An ingredient used by Neri could be too expensive or just impossible to obtain in Brandenburg. One of the most common changes was because of different furnace conditions. For example, in his comments on a Latimo color in the third book, Kunkel writes, the author teaches that the composition should stay in the furnace for 18 days and nights, which however is entirely unnecessary, especially in our German glass furnaces, where it should not stay longer than 3 days or nights. However, the changes introduced following experimentation and adaptation to local materials and knowledge did not suffice to teach the craft of glassmaking. Kunkel was very conscious of the limits of writing and reading. It was a matter of practice. The glassmaker needed to be equipped with a good eye, as Kunkel called it, Augenmaß, so literally something like eye measure. Perhaps those limits were felt more strongly in glassmaking than in any other craft, because it was so visual. Augenmaß was called for when judging the quantities of ingredients which were crucial to obtain colors. Small differences of quantities could result in big differences of color. None of this can be taught on paper, Kunkel concluded, proclaiming the limits of language. In response to these limits, Kunkel introduced the codification of error. He used his translation of Neri as a vehicle, not just for making changes, adapting to local circumstances and procedures, whenever those differed from those found in Neri, but to write down whenever Neri went wrong. Historians of science such as Jutta Schikore and Friedrich Steinel have argued for the importance of error and for going amiss in experimental research. long neglected in the history of science. They've shown that experimentalists learn from error. Shikura has, for example, shown how microscopy in the 18th century was primarily occupied with detecting and documenting sources of observational error. Against this background, Kunkel's identification of errors is even more important than the occasional suggestions for alternatives to Neri's recipes and procedures to make them work. For Kunkel, Ars Vitraria was not just a book about what to do, but also what not to do. So the to do or not to do of my title is not a wordplay taken from Shakespeare by someone who just doesn't have enough time to think of something more creative. It is the translation of a quote from Kunkel's preface to the 1679 edition of Ars Vitraria, was sich tun und nicht tun lassend. The full impact of Kunkel's codification of error only becomes clear in comparison with earlier collections of recipes. Recipes changed, but this was often unnoticed. The standard was silent change. Authors of recipes corrected the recipe sometimes because workshop practice demanded such, but they did not note that they had corrected their source recipe or how exactly the source recipe was lacking. Moreover, authors of recipes seemed more interested in collecting various ways to arrive at the same or similar results than in sorting out the right ways from the wrong. One of the manuscript sources of Neri's L'Arte Vitraria listed no less than 14 different ways to make chalcedony glass, just one after the other, without distinction. Neri himself still lists 3. His emphasis is on the source of experimentation and the networks of material and personal connections in which the recipes were caught. He mentions he practiced the first recipe in Florence at the Casino under the direction of Niccolo Landi in 1601. The second recipe served him to make chalcedony glass in Flanders and was admired by the Grand Duke Ferdinando de' Medici. The third recipe was the outcome of experiments in the glass workshops of Guidolfi in Antwerp in January 1609, and Neri added that he presented 2 pieces of chalcedony glass made according to this technique to the Prince of Orange. Well, as we've seen, Neri read recipes on glassmaking and occasionally named his sources. He did not write down the errors he found in the source recipes. Kunkel did. Sometimes Kunkel completely rejects a recipe for Neri's in his Anmerkungen. For example, on a recipe for imitating lapis lazuli, he writes, "The author shows I'm absolutely certain that he did not try this himself, or else he also would have regarded it differently and abstained from including it in the book because it does not work at all." A recipe could be wrong in different ways. As we've seen already an example, one of the more common errors concerned the quantities of ingredients. At other times, procedures followed by Neri were wrong, not always because they led to the wrong result, but because they contained operations in vain, which were not necessary to reach the goal, or just too cumbersome. For example, on one of Neri's recipes for chalcedony glass, Kunkel noted, "The author makes this recipe difficult and expensive, while it can be done with much less effort and expense." So let me conclude. In this lecture, I've touched on 2 translations, one between workshop practice and words, and another between 2 languages. Kunkel was conscious of the limits of language to render workshop practice. No doubt, translating recipes between 2 languages heightens the awareness of these limits. Questions on the relation between text and practices become acute in the case of translations between languages of recipes and writings on technology. In fact, one wonders whether translation between languages, when confronted with locally specific names and terms, would be even possible without recourse to practice, that is, without trying out the recipe. Kunkel did try out Neri's recipes, and this made him an exceptional reader. As I've argued, typically recipes are translations of workshop practice, moving artisanal knowledge outside the physical boundaries of the workshop. They played a marginal role in the circulation of knowledge within the workshop. We definitely need more research on the question, but it seems that the more typical reader did not try out recipes. Kunkel's translation of glass recipes not only shows how artisanal knowledge traveled from one place to another, geographically and socially, more importantly, I argue that in the process of translation, the concept of artisanal knowledge itself changed. The most marked difference between Neris' L'Arte Vitraria and preceding collections of recipes is the book's naming of people and places, not only of patrons and cities, but also of recent authorities, even if they are as elusive as the non-existent Isaac Hollanders. Artisanal knowledge became the product of experience and reading. In the 17th century, writing about artisanal knowledge came to reflect the process of reading. Kunkel's involvement in alchemical bookish cultures played an important role in his writing on glass, in the sense that it made him test the written. However, Kunkel went a step further by systematically noting errors in source recipes. In response to the limits of language in workshop practice, Kunkel's translation of Neris' book produced what I've called the Codification of Error, as an innovative way of writing down and transmitting artisanal knowledge. Errors mark the boundaries of artisanal knowledge. Their codification allowed artisans to learn from errors. So, not only did translations circulate artisanal knowledge, translations changed the concept of artisanal knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven, for a very enlightening and really inspiring talk. So what shall we do about question time? We have about 15 minutes. Yes, and what I was actually wondering was about do you record it or not? Or just record it only once? Yeah. Right. So we can take questions from the floor, but what we can do is if you have a question, identify themselves so that we can actually get to know each other and match basis to so right question. Or maybe I can start with ask Sven about this. So Kunkel obviously is a really sort of good thing in sort of the genre of recipe, the recipe tradition, if you like. What do you think is sort of, so there's nobody before Kunkel or after Kunkel, or what is the sort of, I guess what I'm actually wanting to know is, there's something about this particular moment, period, within the history of artisanal knowledge that makes Kunkel interesting in that. I mean, why does he suddenly, is he the first person to think about error in this way and reflect it in such a way? I mean, in the big history of the sort of big picture,
Right.
You know, how does he sit? What difference does it make to historians?
Right. I think, first of all, to clarify, it's not, of course, that Kunkel is the first to notice error or to be concerned with error. I mean, you find readers' remarks on recipes from very early on who actually notice errors in recipes. Those typically appear in the margins. I mean, their readership notes basically say, this doesn't work, something just like that, or there's something wrong here. What I do think is relatively new, or starts to happening more in the 17th century, is that these kind of remarks actually move from the margin done by readers, noted down by readers, to actually the publication of, to the body of the text and the publication of the book itself. Yeah, so that's new in a sense. I don't see that before the 17th century. I mean, of course, as you know better, merit has some of this in it. So Kunkel is not the big turning point at which everything changed. I think this is a longer, more stretched process, in which several factors play a role. Beginning this kind of print culture, bringing actually artisanal knowledge to print, which changes the way that it is being approached. There's definitely also in the background institutions, like the Royal Society, who actually kind of work in that direction, who kind of collect artisanal knowledge in systematic ways, grouped also around very specific trades of very specific crafts. I think that's also, it's a very big difference in the way these things are approached from the late 16th, early 17th century on, is that you basically get very, very typical collections of recipes on very specific issues, rather than miscellaneous recipes with all kinds of things to each other, so that people would also feel less at ease, in fact, with engaging with those texts in terms of trying them out. It's good. Part of what you, okay.
So my question would be about this difference between the description of practices and description of the concepts. Or to be more precise, the description, the difference between something that can be taught on paper, which is concept, and something that cannot be taught through paper, which is practice. We should also mark the difference between experience and descriptive knowledge within this field of artistry or chemistry. So my question would be, perhaps some kind of sort of put a magnifying glass on this border between experience knowledge and descriptive knowledge, what can be and cannot be with paper. And kind of give a more precise, perhaps, definition. How does this author see the border between what can be and cannot be taught through paper and described in words?
Right. That's a very big question. I'll try to approach it a bit. I think what for Kunkel is important is that, but it's very. That's why I stressed at one point that we're really talking about glassmaking. So there's something very specific, I think, also about this trade, which, well, specific in the sense that it might indeed work as a magnifying glass for what actually might be happening in other trades. But in glassmaking, because it is so visual, and you so much depend upon judging the visual outcome of what you do, constantly moving back and forward. Basically for Kunkel, this exact coordination between what you do, also in terms of exact, just in how you do it, but how much, for example, you add of a certain raw material to a certain paste, for example, is something that cannot be described in words. Now, I could imagine that also similar things in other crafts, but being such a visual craft, this is really in glass. You can see that very, very clearly, and this is something. I mean, judging. I mean, there are all kinds of problems there, both from. I mean, that are mostly to do with judging exactly color, and that's very problematic. And that's very problematic both in glass as well as in alchemy, as well as some other crafts where. Basically, what's something, I mean, how you perceive the color is basically tells you whether you're doing something right or not. And what Kunkel says, that problem is something that you cannot describe in words. So, good.
Al Watson, Durham University. I was struck by what you said about leaving Italian terms in translation. And I just wanted to check with you that I understood what you were suggesting that the purpose of him doing that was. That it was to create a multilingual context that artisans work. And do you mean that he was sort of encouraging artisans receiving his translated text to place their work in the context of artisans working in other countries? And is that in order that they might better collect more recipes, or that they might sort of then be working in tandem and be better placed to sort of push
I think there's several things at play. One is that he basically seems to encouraging. I mean, it all have to do with internationalization, in a sense. Yeah, I hear. So what he's basically encouraging German artisans to do, or German glassmakers, which he directed in his glass workshop, to be very clear about. So this was in a relatively concrete situation on the work floor, to actually read Neri's texts on glassmaking in the original language and create some kind of thesaurus, so that they could cross-references and actually be not dependent upon his translation in German of the Italian texts. Yeah, and that has to do, I think, with creating, indeed, with making knowledge kind of move, kind of collecting whatever actually is being done in glassmaking on an international basis, and actually also have glassmakers communicate with each other across language and geographical boundaries. And that's, I think, really behind what, I mean, it's one of the issues that's really behind what Kunkel is trying to do, except really also kind of giving them some kind of method to work properly and to show to others that they can work properly. So there's these two aspects to it. Is that?
Yeah, that's...
Yeah.
I'm very fascinated by the way that Kunkel talks about
Sorry?
I'm very fascinated by the precise way in which Kunkel expresses what one does with the body, how he expresses the language of recipe. Because, you know, this quote reminds one of the French "ça se fait pas," or "it's not done," that kind of language. And my question wants to take this up, moving it back a little bit into the realm of natural magic, where this is sort of coming from. Very quick to Renaissance. I just wanted to ask you, my impression is often in natural magic texts that their approach to what we usually call recipe is, I'm often struck by the way in which it actually reminds me of ritual, in the sense that there's a very different way of conceptualizing the relationship between what we do with the body and the effect that flows from it. It's as if these people have a certain desire, and then they chart ways of externalizing that desire in the world out there. And these are your possibilities, as you so nicely put it, you know, sort of collecting possible ways of going about things. Whereas here, I mean, ça se fait pas, this is not done, that's the language of recipe, the way I recognize it. So I'm just wondering whether what you point out in Kunkel teaching people how to do things right doesn't also involve a very different way of framing the relationship between desire, bodily enactment, and you know, that's my question essentially.
I'm not so sure that in general, I'll try to approach it in that way. I'm not so sure that what Kunkel is doing has, as I understood you well, that you recognize this language from natural magic. This does not seem to be a direct context which is relevant at all for what Kunkel is trying to do. So it certainly does not function as a source of something that has really shaped the way he's really talking about bodily involvements. And I think in general, I mean, although you say, I see lots of that you're interested in the ways he talks about bodily involvement, Kunkel very rarely really talks about bodily involvement. There are hardly any bodies, there are hardly any hands, really, in what he does. I mean, he tells you how things are done or how to do something, but he doesn't really tell you what kind of bodily skills you would need to do that. How you would, I mean, there are all kinds of, I mean, in the later, in the 18th century, you find people who actually, for example, in grinding telescopes, actually something completely different. Grinding telescopes are actually trying to describe in numerous detail, inventing a complete language, how you have to move your hand in what way, etc. This is largely absent from Kunkel, as it is from the whole recipe literature. Yeah? This is not something you would find in it. This is absolutely, it's not there at all. Yeah? So I don't see in that sense a difference between Kunkel and other recipes. It's just, I think, because he sees all these limits to what he can in fact express in words or in images, for that sense, which he is relatively silent, not explicit about, that he invents this idea of codification of error as a way to proceed forwards. Yeah? But because he just cannot describe this. And Kunkel is not different there than anything that actually happens before him. Yeah? Right.
I'm just wondering about the notion of error and getting things right.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you see a connection there as a kind of imperative with the religious zeitgeist of the period as in truth and getting the right religion, or whether that's a coincidence?
That's a very good question. It's a very broad question. I don't think I'm actually very much able to answer it properly, even because at the level of epistemology, at the cognitive level, I'm not fully 100% sure whether I've actually mapped all the different meanings of wrong, of geirrt in Kunkel, because it's quite, I've noticed some of them, but there must be more. Yeah? So there's really something I'm absolutely interested in doing, and how actually we'll move this forward, is getting better an idea of what wrong what it all can be, yeah, in the periods. Yeah? And so how this relates, I see indeed all these kind of interesting connections to larger religious issues, to moral issues, to what extent this is a moral imperative, etc., etc. But I've not gotten so far, yeah, at this point.
I'm John Gallagher from the University of Cambridge. I wanted to ask, I'm really intrigued by what you say about creating a kind of multilingual environment within the text and leaving Italian phrases as they are. And I wanted to, in my own work on earlier glassworks in the late 16th century, early 17th century, certainly in England, these are very much multilingual environments where you have Venetian workers and English workers working side by side, and you get this impression that there's James Howell speaks of it having picked up Italian through working in a glassworks in early 17th century England. And I wonder to what extent, thinking about that, to what extent the use of these practices in the text are reflective of oral, multilingual, vernacular processes at work in these artisanal sensory oral contexts. So to what extent this is a textual reflection of oral practice. Yes, no, I think you're right, spot on. This is absolutely a reflection of multilingual environments, daily an oral culture, which is very much multilingual. Yeah. So, and that's also very much the case for Kunkel, because the people he's talking to have backgrounds sometimes in Italy, etc. So this is the daily oral culture of the workshop, which he's basically engaging with. So it is a reflection. It is very much a reflection of that. Are there any texts that can get us any closer to how those environments function? Not for Kunkel, as far as I know. Yeah, that's a big, not really. I mean, there's some core documents that you might go through, which actually might also use some of the ways that he's for example, being given privileges, etc., etc. Whether some of that multilingual terminology actually turns up in there too, I can't really say that for the moment. But that would be a possible source to look at for this kind of thing.
Why then would we have to explain what the term means to, if it's a multilingual environment, why is he having to explain to people who don't understand?
Because they're graded
yes.
of the practitioner.
Right. So he's not. I mean, there's this whole rhetoric, I think, in which he's basically directly speaking to these German glass workers but he's not, of course. I mean, he's addressing a much wider readership, yeah, of patrons, including. Sorry. Yeah, he says it is the glassmakers who do not understand. Yeah, but I do think that's. I mean, to some extent, it's very rhetorical stance, yeah.
I'm afraid we are really out of time, so in order to keep on schedule, let's do